My beloved child, stop scrolling for a moment. What you are about to hear was meant to find you at a moment when your heart was quietly asking questions your lips were afraid to speak. You may not understand why these words appeared before you today, but something inside you already knows that this message is connected to a story you have been trying to understand for far longer than anyone realizes. Pause here, take one slow breath, because there is something you have not been told. Someone connected to your heart has been carrying a truth behind closed doors, and the reason you have felt confusion, distance, strange silence, and unanswered questions is not because you imagined everything. There were pieces of a story that never reached you. There were conversations that stopped before the important part. There were explanations that sounded complete but were carefully missing the one detail that could have changed everything. And child, you have felt that missing piece. You felt it in the moments when their words did not match their energy. You felt it when they disappeared and returned as though nothing had happened. You felt it when you tried to convince yourself that you were simply overthinking, only to find the same question returning when the room became quiet. Why did they never tell me the whole story? That question has followed you, tonight, in this fictional spiritual message. Imagine heaven drawing back the curtain, not to frighten you, not to make you suspicious of everyone around you, but to help you understand why a certain connection has felt so strangely unfinished. There is a person whose story became complicated before you ever entered it, and here is where the mystery begins. You believed you were meeting someone who was emotionally available, someone whose past could be explained in a few sentences, someone whose life had already settled into a simple shape. But the truth was more tangled than that. There was another commitment, there was another chapter, there was a marriage, or a relationship carrying the weight, history, and consequences of one, that they did not fully reveal to you. And before your heart races toward the conclusion, listen carefully. This is not simply a story about betrayal. It is a story about unfinished choices. It is a story about someone who may have been living between two versions of themselves, the person they showed the world and the person they became when they were alone. You were never given the entire map. You were handed fragments, a few memories, a few explanations, a few carefully chosen sentences, and you were expected to understand the entire journey from those fragments, but you could not. How could you? You were trying to solve a story while someone else was quietly removing pages from the book. There were moments when you sensed something was wrong. And then you would feel guilty for sensing it. You would tell yourself, maybe I am being too sensitive. Maybe I am expecting too much. Maybe they are simply afraid. Maybe I should give them more time. So you waited, and while you waited, they continued carrying something they had not placed in your hands. That is why this message begins with patience, not because you should wait forever, not because you should chase someone who refuses to speak, but because there is a difference between a mystery and a truth that is finally ready to be understood. Your heart has been trying to separate those two things, and tonight, the first layer begins to fall away. Think back to the beginning. There was something about this person that felt strangely familiar. Maybe it was the way they looked at you. Maybe it was how quickly conversations became personal. Maybe you felt as though you could tell them things you normally kept hidden. Maybe their presence awakened an emotion you had not felt in years. You may even have wondered whether this was the person you had been waiting for, and because the connection felt intense, you gave certain moments a deeper meaning. You remembered their words, you remembered the timing, you remembered the strange coincidences, you remembered the nights when they seemed emotionally close and the mornings when they suddenly became distant. You noticed everything, but you did not have the information required to interpret everything correctly. That is the part that matters, because sometimes the deepest confusion is not caused by a lack of intuition, it is caused by incomplete information. You can have a sensitive heart and still misunderstand a situation when someone is withholding the context. You can recognize genuine emotion and still fail to see that the person expressing it has obligations, fears, history, or commitments they have not disclosed, and this person had history, more than you knew. There were decisions made before you, promises made before you, perhaps even vows, responsibilities, or expectations that had existed long before your name entered their story. Yet something changed after meeting you, and that change frightened them, not necessarily because you did something wrong, but because your presence forced them to look at a life they had been avoiding. Suddenly, the choices they had postponed became impossible to ignore. The relationship they had settled into no longer felt as simple as it once did. The future they had accepted began to feel different. And instead of facing the truth immediately, they chose silence. That silence became the first wall between you. You may have interpreted it as rejection. They may have experienced it as conflict. You may have thought, they don't care. They may have been thinking, I don't know how to explain this without destroying everything. But silence does not automatically become innocent simply because it comes from fear. Remember that fear can explain a person's behavior. It does not erase the consequences of that behavior, and this is where your story becomes deeper than romance. Because you have been asking whether the connection was real. But perhaps the more important question is, was the person capable of handling what was real? Those are not the same question. A person can feel deeply and still act selfishly. A person can miss you and still hide from you. A person can love the feeling of your presence while being unwilling to make the difficult choices required to build an honest future. That contradiction is painful. But it is also revealing. You were looking at their feelings. You needed to look at their decisions. And their decisions told a story their words did not. There may have been a moment when they almost told you. Remember that moment. Perhaps the conversation started normally. Perhaps they became unusually quiet. Perhaps they looked as though they were preparing to say something important. Maybe you even felt the atmosphere change. And then suddenly, they changed the subject. They laughed. They distracted you. They said, "It's complicated." Or perhaps they promised to explain later. Later became another day. Another day became another week. And eventually, you stopped asking. Not because you stopped caring, because you became exhausted from carrying questions that should never have belonged to you alone. My beloved child, there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who gives you just enough truth to keep you hoping, but never enough truth to let you feel safe. You know that exhaustion. It lives in the way you reread old messages. It lives in the questions you ask yourself after midnight. It lives in the strange habit of replaying conversations and searching for clues that were invisible at the time. You wonder whether you missed something, whether there was a warning, whether one sentence meant more than you understood, whether the distance was connected to someone else, whether the person you loved had already promised their life to another person, and perhaps now you are hearing this title and feeling a strange recognition. Your soulmate is already married. Those words sound final, but they are not the entire story, because marriage is not merely a label. It can represent history, responsibility, fear, obligation, family pressure, unfinished wounds, legal ties, emotional dependence, or a life. Someone entered before they fully understood themselves, and sometimes a person remains inside a relationship long after their heart has admitted that something is broken. But child, do not mistake brokenness for permission. That distinction will become important, because there is another secret beneath the secret. The hidden marriage was not necessarily the only thing concealed. There may have been a reason they did not tell you, and that reason is where the story becomes more complicated. Perhaps they feared losing you. Perhaps they feared losing the life they had built. Perhaps they believed they could keep both worlds separated. Perhaps they convinced themselves that no decision had to be made yet. Or perhaps they were waiting for circumstances to change so they would not have to be the one to change them. Do you see the pattern? Delay, silence, half-truths, emotional closeness, sudden distance. Then return. The cycle repeats because the person has not resolved the conflict inside themselves. And every time they returned, a part of you wondered whether this time would be different. Maybe they would finally explain. Maybe they would finally choose. Maybe they would finally say what they were too afraid to say before. But there is something you need to hear now. Your worth was never supposed to depend on whether another person could make a decision. You were not created to sit outside someone else's locked door, waiting for them to decide whether you deserved the truth. You were not meant to become a secret in a story that demanded honesty. Have felt so powerful that you interpreted the pain as proof of destiny. That is a dangerous mistake. Intensity is not always destiny. Longing is not always confirmation. Chemistry is not always compatibility. And a connection that feels impossible to forget can still require boundaries. This is where the heavenly message becomes less about the other person and more about you. Because while you were searching for what they hid, you were also losing sight of what you were becoming. You became more anxious, more watchful, more dependent on signs. You began measuring your peace by their behavior. When they came closer, you felt hope. When they pulled away, you felt abandoned. When they spoke warmly, you felt chosen. When they became silent, you questioned your worth. That is not the freedom your heart was searching for, and perhaps that is why this revelation is arriving now. Not to tell you to run toward them, not to tell you to destroy another relationship, not to promise that a hidden marriage will magically disappear, but to return something to you that you gave away while waiting for answers. Your discernment, your dignity, your ability to say, I deserve the whole truth. Because there is still more, much more. The marriage itself may have a history that you were never told. There may have been a beginning that looked different from what you imagined. There may have been a promise made under circumstances you never knew about. There may have been family involvement, pressure, fear, or an old wound that influenced the decision, and there may have been a moment when this person considered telling you everything. They may have even written the words. They may have stood with their phone in their hand. They may have started a message. They may have typed your name, then stopped, deleted it, put the phone down, and told themselves, "Not yet." But not yet can become years, and every year a truth is delayed, the cost of revealing it becomes heavier. That is why their silence became so complicated, the longer they hid the truth. The harder it became to confess. One secret required another explanation, one omission required another, one lie, even a small one, created a path that eventually became difficult to leave, and perhaps that is why, when you finally sensed something was wrong, they did not simply tell you. They became defensive. They changed the subject. They made you question yourself, not necessarily because they wanted to hurt you, but because admitting the truth would force them to face the consequences. And consequences were exactly what they had been avoiding. Listen carefully now. There is a difference between someone who cannot tell you the truth and someone who chooses not to. There is a difference between confusion and concealment. There is a difference between being afraid and repeatedly allowing another person to live without informed choice. You deserved informed choice. You deserved to know what you were stepping into. You deserved to know whether the person you were emotionally investing in was actually free to build the future they were allowing you to imagine. And perhaps the greatest wound was not that they were married. Perhaps the greatest wound was that they let you dream without giving you the information required to dream responsibly. That is why your heart still feels unsettled. Because part of you is not mourning the person, part of you is mourning the future you imagined with incomplete information. You are mourning a possibility, a version of the story that might have existed if the truth had been spoken earlier, and that grief is real, even in fiction, even in a spiritual story, even when no one else understands why it hurts so much. But child, do not close your heart yet, because the story has not reached its deepest chamber. There is one piece of history that changes how everything you thought you knew begins to look. It concerns the moment this person realized that meeting. You had awakened something they could no longer suppress. It was not simply attraction. It was not merely curiosity. Something in them confronted something they had buried, and when that happened, they had a choice. They could have told you the truth. They could have stepped away. They could have ended the confusion before it grew. Instead, they remained in the middle, and the middle became their hiding place. But what they did not realize was that the truth was already moving toward the surface. You were going to discover something. A detail, a conversation, a name, a piece of history, something they never expected you to see, and when you saw it, the entire timeline began to change. Suddenly, old memories looked different, old conversations sounded different, their disappearances had another meaning, their sudden tenderness had another meaning. Even the moments when they seemed afraid to look directly into your eyes began to make sense. You had thought you were imagining the contradiction. You were not. There was a contradiction, and now, just as you begin to understand why they hid the marriage, another question rises from the darkness: who knew about you? Because there is a possibility that someone else knew far more than you realized, someone who watched the story unfold from the outside, someone who may have understood the hidden connection before you did. Someone who may have known the marriage, known the history, and known exactly why this person kept returning to you, and that person is connected to the next revelation, because the secret was never only about a married soulmate, the secret was about a choice. A choice they made before you knew there was a choice to make, and the strange part is this: they may have already made that choice once, but they never told you what happened afterward. So if you have been wondering why this person could never completely leave your life, why they disappeared but somehow always seemed to circle back, why every attempt to close the door felt incomplete, then stay with this story. Because the next part begins at the moment the hidden history finally collided with the present, and what was discovered then was not something anyone could easily explain. There was a truth about the marriage, a truth about their past, and a truth about what they felt when they first realized they could lose you. You have been waiting for the missing piece. You thought the missing piece was their confession. It wasn't. The missing piece was what they did after realizing you knew enough to ask the question they could no longer escape, and that moment is where the story changes forever, because someone opened a door, someone finally spoke a name, and the name was connected to a secret they had sworn would never reach you. The next words they heard were the last words they expected, and once those words were spoken, there was no way to return to the old story again.